Now, considering that Africa is seen as a hot growth area in terms of telecommunications, the projections for general sector growth at 1 to 3%, are those still applicable in Africa, or can we look at different targets?
Generally, we see a correlation between the GDP growth, and if you look at the projections for Africa as a whole, there's some countries in the single high digits. South Africa alone expected to grow at least 3% this year, 4% next year. And if you look at just the revenue growth of the operators, at least that we analyze, Cell C, MTN, many of them have had high single digits. So I think that's probably more realistic.
Many experts believe that consumer spending is really what's going to drive up revenue growth for service providers. But we've also seen in many African economies regulation intervening in terms of interconnection fees, termination rates fees. And if you're seeing those costs coming down, will that not have a direct impact and in fact nullify the fact that the consumer is growing?
No, we don't believe it'll nullify. I think there's still a very under-penetrated market, and as the penetration levels approach those of more developing countries, there's still space to grow the top line, and so most operators should see that benefit.
Many of these service providers are going to be bleeding cash, we're told, in the year to come, and that's largely due to capex directed at network refurbishment, upgrades and expansion. How severe is that situation going to be on the bottom line?
I think there's clearly a competition in terms of just providing data. That's clearly the focus of all the operators. You see Cell C, Telecom now entering the mobile spectrum. You see obviously MTN, Vodacom in South Africa, all competing fiercely. We do expect that free cash flow, which is basically the cash flow after capex, to be pressured, but that will be probably for a few years, but generally these companies tend to be free cash flow positive.
Now we've seen the entry of dominant Indian players like Bharti Airtel into 15 African countries. We're still seeing leadership on the part of MTN and the rest of Africa, but some are saying room for organic growth is questionable. It may just be time for consolidation. Are we going to see M&A activity in the telecom space?
Yeah, I think there is an expectation of M&A as other operators look to diversify into higher growth markets, and clearly Africa as a whole does present growth opportunities for many of the operators working mainly in the developed markets. France Telecom alone has announced that it will double the capex in Africa. That's something we highlighted in our report. So I think there is clearly going to be more consolidation M&A activity.
Let's talk about the situation in mature markets like South Africa. Some people say 3 service providers, 2 operate almost in an oligopolic manner, and it's largely because it's a saturated market, especially for voice services. Data is the new way to go. What are your views on what is available and could be available in this saturated and mature market?
Yeah, we agree that, I mean, you have a phenomenon also that prepaid subscribers compose the majority of the subscriber base for most operators. But data, there's clearly the avenue for growth for many of the operators, and that's why we see most of the investments really being devoted in that area. So I think that'll be the new frontier for growth for most operators.
But in this very mature market, there's still the basic challenge of bandwidth, the speeds, despite the entry of CCOM, for instance, the costs. How do we overcome those shortcomings?
I think that's why the bleeding cash, again, I mean, the expectation that capex will have to be higher in the next few years to address the infrastructure to be able to provide such higher bandwidths. But that's, I think, an area that all major players are embarking in.
How would you rate the service providers in this country, MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, and indeed Telecom, now that they're moving into the mobile space as well?
Improving. Yeah, no, in general, I think there's room for improvement, obviously. There's, I think, been some dissatisfaction in terms of the service that they've provided for the customers. But everybody is aware, and the market is extremely competitive, so they will have to set themselves apart by improving in terms of just overall satisfaction
and
levels.
just still on that tack, the regulatory environment in South Africa, we've seen ICASA coming in defense of the consumer in many ways, saying you've got to cut interconnect fees, for instance. Then the service providers together saying, okay, concession is we can do a mandatory cut, but that's on condition that we stop too many regulatory reviews over the next 3 years. Has there been too much of a heavy hand on the part of the government, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we don't like to just comment specifically on that, but in general, I mean, that's a scenario that we observe across the global telecom operators, the regulatory environment, and we'll continue to monitor that and the impact that it can have in terms of the cash flow generation of these companies.
In terms of your outlook for this as an economy and the telecom sector and growing this economy, what do you think we're going to see? Segmented growth, consolidation, and new investments?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about at least the three companies that we do rate, which are Cell C, Telecom, and MTN, I mean, MTN has a positive outlook, while Telecom has a negative outlook, and Cell C with a stable. I think the growth opportunities are there. You have particular issues going on with each one of them. Telecom mainly being the successful entry into the mobile market. Cell C is actually the smaller, but it's proving to be the one that is at least advertising quite aggressively in terms of the data and internet service, providing that service at a more aggressive level. Whilst MTN is clearly the player that's mostly multi-regional. But in general, I think we have a stable outlook for the sector and for the country.